do you want to introduce?
Oh,
okay. Going to introduce Hannah, who is going to be talking a little bit about to us about her northern hawk owl research. And I think you said you're on the West Coast now, correct? Where you're coming from tonight. So a little bit different weather system that you're seeing there. And we're very excited to have you joining us on Zoom tonight and are excited to hear all about your research. So thanks, Hannah, for joining us tonight.
All right. Thanks, Liz and Brad, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. I am really excited to talk to you about my master's work that I completed this past May. So I ended up getting a job on the West Coast, so I'm coming to you from Seattle. But today we're going to talk all about northern hawk owls and looking at their winter habitat use and movement. And this was really done at the University of Minnesota in Duluth, where I did field research for the past few years, and then with the support of Ridge Bird Observatory. Make sure I can advance. All right, so starting out, I'm sure some of you have seen hawk owls. Usually if I'm in person, I ask how many people have seen hawk owls. But since we're sort of in this hybrid situation, I'll just show you a few scenes of hawk owls that I was able to see and where their habitats were before we dive into the rest of the presentation. And I hope this sound should work. Give you an idea what they sound like too. They get harassed by a lot of different species. They're sometimes found in farmland or places we don't necessarily think they will be. All right, so just giving you a little kind of picture into some of the places that I got to be and see these magnificent birds. Another question I like to start with is this bird a hawk or an owl? And I'm sure many of you know that it is a true owl species. So it has some hawk-like tendencies where it uses eyesight primarily for hunting, and it doesn't actually have silent flight, but it is part of the Strigidae family. There are 3 recognized subspecies of hawk owls. So they're circumpolar, which means that they're found both in North America and Europe and then in Central Asia. Kind of some of the differences are ours are in North America are much darker in plumage, slightly bigger. And then the other 2 are much more similar in terms of what they look like, but in terms of their phenotypic composition, they are separated by subspecies. So the one I'm going to focus on today, this is just an eBird map sort of showing you that same distribution. So ours is in purple, Europe's in green, and then Central Asia is in red. And here you can kind of see the eBird location maps of where people have seen these birds. Most of them, right, are more focused from eBird in North America and Europe. Not to say they don't exist over sort of in the southeastern side, but potentially eBird is not used as frequently over there. But I'm going to focus on the North American subspecies. So really this kind of core boreal forest range is where hawk owls are known to be, and they're not known to be migratory. They're sort of known to be more of a nomadic species, and they go through these eruption cycles where they kind of dip down into the southern parts of their limit in the winter. And that's, down towards, maybe more northern Wisconsin, maybe not quite farthest south, but they have reached that kind of limit before. And then a little reason why I kind of was looking at hawk owls and trying to figure out what I wanted to do my research on is they are a climate endangered species. So National Audubon sort of created these climate maps, and they did this prediction where if in the winter, the temperature increased by 3 degrees, you would see this change. So in yellow, sort of on this left side, this is just their normal range maintained, really matches that boreal forest range that we saw on the previous slide. And then by year 2080, so we're fast forwarding now only 57 years, they're losing 72% of that range if we see a 3-degree increase in temperature. They're gaining some of that back. So they're losing about 20% overall. They're gaining 52 back farther north. But it kind of makes you think about what the habitat is like up there, if there's big enough snags for them to nest or perch on to hunt. So they are known as a climate endangered species. And I do want to point out that hawk owls are really hard to survey. So it's really hard to get a global estimate of the population using breeding bird counts or Christmas bird counts or things like that. So it's not necessarily that they're not threatened species. It's just hard to actually estimate their population. So I'll give you a little context for why I picked this species. So northern hawk owls, the Cernia alula caproach is the one subspecies in North America. They are one of the least studied birds in North America. They're both eruptive and nomadic. So again, eruptive means there's a really big boom in their production during the summer. And then the following year, there's a prey crash. So there's lots of hawk owls, not enough prey, and they move farther and farther south in search of prey. And then they're known to be nomadic due to the fact that they sort of follow their prey wherever it's abundant. And then their winter ecology is largely unknown. So looking at the literature, trying to sort of figure out what people have researched in the past, there's only about 10 empirical research studies that have been done on the North American subspecies, and most of them are in the breeding season. So winter ecology was sort of a hot pocket of a knowledge gap that I wanted to fill. So in terms of past research, I won't go into all of them, but harvested areas, prey cycles, looking at summer and fall home range, and then looking at some winter evidence were a few papers that I kind of looked at to figure out what area of study I wanted to focus on for this species. So in terms of habitat and sort of forestry management, Patsy Duncan did a review of past habitat, sort of forestry practices in hawk owl ranges. And she found, doing a lot of different analyses, that results were basically if there was a less than 100 hectare cut made in like a black spruce forest or maybe in a bog or something like that, that was actually really beneficial for hawk owls. So hawk owls, in terms of their hunting, like to hunt from a high perch, but have sort of a small open area where they're able to catch small rodents and potentially other prey. She also noted that they need large snags to be left in cuts for perches and for nest sites. So that was sort of her kind of conclusion for looking at habitat. And then in terms of prey cycles, which I did not do any small mammal trapping or any identification of prey for my project, but I just wanted to note that prey is super important for, an apex predator like a hawk owl. And there are differences in prey cycles between here in North America and then Fennoscandia, which is where a lot of other research has been done for hawk owls. So you don't have to know sort of the nitty-gritty of the prey cycles in North America, but I did want to just pull this up and say that they are different, they are important, but I will not be focusing on them for my research. So if you have questions about that, feel free to ask them, but there's other experts out there that would have better answers. And then there was a paper done in Southeast Norway, and it was really the first tracking study that was done on hawk owls. And they were able to catch 5 hawk owls, 3 males and 2 females, and they were radio tracking them. So they were using handheld VHF telemetry. So really hard work. They were mainly doing it in the summer and fall. And this is sort of what they found with tracking these hawk owls from 3 to 16 weeks. So it wasn't a huge chunk of time, but they sort of started looking at the relative size and shape of these home ranges created by these hawk owls. So I just wanted to show you, since this paper was done in the 80s, sort of this was an idea of, okay, hawk owls might stick to an area in the summer and fall, but do they do the same thing in the winter? We don't know. And then lastly, for some background info, there was a wintering owl in Winnipeg that Dr. Robert Nero, who is now sadly passed, but he observed a hawk owl that was likely the same bird all winter long, so for 3 months. And it was really the first beginnings of defining a winter home range and saying, hey, maybe these birds are not as nomadic as we had previously thought, that maybe they stick to an area in the winter if they have good habitat, they have a good food source, but maybe they're jumping around if they don't. So kind of thinking about how they're spending their time in the winter and what that looks like. So he was able to sketch out sort of some primary perch sites and then some areas where he was able to detect the hawk owl. Again, it was likely the same bird, but there was no tracking involved, so we were not 100% sure, but it looked like it was the same individual kind of in this really small patch for 3 months at a time. So really kind of the start of me asking, okay, can we actually quantify this and see that in tracking data. So that led me to my research questions. I have 3, but I'll talk about 2 main ones today. So 1, do hawk owls establish a winter territory or home range? So can we actually quantify that with putting tracking devices on owls and seeing those movements in a fashion that they're sticking to one area? And then 2, the second part was looking at if we can create a species distribution map and accurately predict habitat suitability for hawk owls using eBird data. So kind of trying to figure out, since we don't have a good way of surveying these birds in terms of detecting them on large scale surveys, can we build a distribution model and see if that, is accurately predicting habitat suitability? So those are the 2 big questions that I had. In terms of study design, so the first thing I had to do was find funding. So tracking devices, little transmitters are pretty expensive. So that was a big part of trying to figure out, okay, can I get enough small grants, get some fundraiser money? And if you did buy a t-shirt or sweatshirt or something from my fundraising campaign, thank you. It was really beneficial. And then step 2 is actually finding the hawk owls, which during my study period, there was supposed to be an eruption of owls going further south into northern Minnesota, but that didn't happen. So it was pretty hard to find enough owls. And then getting permits and being able to capture these hawk owls at the sort of southern edge of their winter range, because that area is what we were really looking at, especially with their, potential climate change affecting that region of their winter habitat. And then attaching the transmitters, being able to track the movements, analyzing the data so we could answer question 1, and then building the model so we could answer question 2. So that's just kind of a rundown of how my study was designed. And then in terms of trapping, so a lot of people ask me, okay, how do you see an owl, how do you actually catch it? So we use 2 different types of methods. One is a ball chatry trap, one is a dip net. And with the ball chatry, there's little leg noose harnesses. So there's a lure in the middle, and then an owl comes in, kind of prances around, and then gets caught. We run out and grab it. Or if you're using the dip net method, you're putting sort of a lure on a string. Hawk owls are super aggressive, so they come in even if you're sitting right there, and you catch them with the net. So pretty fun and exciting to do. And then there's lots of permitting that's involved to make sure the pros outweigh the negatives for doing any research with live animals. So just a small video of what that trapping process looks like. So there's an owl sort of taking off on the right side, and I'll play that right now. So then the owl will kind of move around to get caught, and we'll run out and grab it safely. All right, so the evolution of transmitter technology has been pretty huge in the last, 10 to 15 years. Previously, transmitters really were too big for remote tracking of hawk owls. So this graph is basically just showing you the number of species and then the body mass of those species and how many types of transmitters can go on those species in terms of how big they are. And really the cellular and satellite tracking could only go on things like eagles or waterfowl or things like that in, a lot of studies. But now there are some companies that are sort of on the cutting edge of figuring out how to make those lighter and lighter. So I was able to get some of these units. Oh, sorry, new technology, right? It's untested, but it could pay off. And I worked with cellular tracking technology to sort of develop a size that would fit a hawk owl, which was pretty hard to do because they are so small. So an average hawk owl weighs probably about 350 grams or something like that. So we really needed to get the transmitter size down to about 10 grams. And that was tricky. Most of these units that capture this high resolution data are between 20 and 30 grams. So it took a lot of time to develop a way to be able to capture this data. And then there's another decision based off if you're using satellite units, so it's actually pinging off of satellites, or if you're using cellular units, the GSM GPS units that ping off of cell towers, just like your cell phones or Apple Watches or things like that. So I talked a lot with other researchers, the lead researcher Neil Paprocki on the Rough-Legged Hawk Project, Dave Brinker and Scott Weidensaul of Project Snowstorm, a few others, trying to get an idea of what would work. And we decided to go with the solar-powered cellular units, not necessarily because we think hawk owls are always in cell service, because they're a remote species, so they're not always, so that's kind of a risk, but because the satellite units have this long antenna, and what Project Snowstorm saw with snowy owls is that they would just chomp that antenna right off, and then they would lose all of that data after putting, this transmitter on the owl, putting the owl through the process, and they just weren't getting a lot of data back. With hawk owls, they're really feisty, which you'll see in a video in just a minute. So we decided that we wanted to try for, some successful data. So we went with those GSM GPS units, and we kind of decided, okay, we're going to put these on, see if it works. We were able to attach them. This is one of the first ones that has this little backpack transmitter. And then holding our breath, we started seeing some data and some really cool movements from these owls. So this has never been done before, which is always a risk, especially for, a master's project that doesn't last a super long time, but we were able to pull it off. So in terms of where we're able to capture these owls in the study location, so right down here is a bird at Zaxton Bog, which maybe some of you have been to, but then most of the others were in northern Minnesota and then southern Manitoba. So we had 7 total in Manitoba, 4 in Minnesota for a sample size of 11, which might not seem huge, but it is one of the biggest sample sizes of any hawk owl study. So we were pretty happy with that. And we did expand up into southern Manitoba because a lot of hawk owls didn't end up coming down into northern Minnesota. So it was dependent on where we found hawk owls. You're scanning those spruce tops, really hoping to find one, spending miles and hours driving long roads. So it really depended on where hawk owls were. And then a lot of people sent us sightings, which was great, to be able to try to find owls in certain places. And then it wouldn't have been possible without collaborating with Jim and Patsy Duncan up in Manitoba. They were able to, get us on their permits and help us with the trapping process, which, a lot of hawk owls were found up there. So that's sort of the areas where we were. And then just to give you an idea of some extreme winter conditions, as you know, being in the Midwest, it can get cold. But up farther north, we got to, I think, -42 as our coldest temperature while we were out doing field work. Lots of snow. We did a lot of snowshoeing, trying to find owls that weren't necessarily associated with roads. That didn't always pan out. So just to give you kind of a picture of what that looked like. And then here's a few quick videos just showing you the process. And you can kind of see how we attach these transmitters to the owls.
All right, so this is a northern hawk owl, and it's getting a little backpack transmitter. So what we've done is we've put the harness over the front and sort of fitted it to the spot on its back, where it's loose enough that, it still has some flexibility, but will stay in place. And so now we tied some knots, and I'm gonna go out and let the bird flap to make sure that there's no impairment to the wing.
Okay. We'll see the bird.
All right, so
this is where the bird gets a little feisty once it realizes, oh, I can move my wings and fly. In general, when you have them and you're putting the transmitter on, they're pretty calm from what we found. But then at this stage, they were definitely ready to go.
All right, so now we're gonna just make sure it can flap and see if it's kind of symmetrical on both sides. It's definitely ready to get going, but it looks like it's flapping fine. So now we'll just go ahead and finish up sewing the transmitter, gluing it, and get this bird on its way.
Right, and then here we have one of my awesome field assistants, Danny Erickson, releasing the bird back into its normal habitat. And this is really the best moment of, making sure everything looks good on the bird, they fly away fine, and then we watch them for about 15 minutes to make sure they're going back to their normal behavior. All right. So a little bit of a kind of field data summary, and this was really in the winter of 2021 to 2023. We did only catch 1 bird in 2023, but we were able to band 20 birds total, put out 11 transmitters. We did have a 12th that we put out, but it failed right away just in terms of the transmitter, quality. So we were able to recapture that bird a few months later and it was totally fine. So it was kind of nice to see that there was no rubbing, and the transmitter looked good. So we sent it back to the CTT company. We were able to get about 12 points on average a day. So some birds had many more points. Some had like 48 a day. Some birds only had 2 or 3, depending on battery life. So battery life was also a big concern because it's really cold. In terms of cell phones or things like that, we know batteries have a hard time staying charged. So with that solar power panel, we were hoping that would happen. So it did for some, and then not for others. The average days tracked was about 56, and we were able to catch 6 males and 14 females. 2 males got transmitters, and the rest of them were female. So we only had 2 males compared to 9 females with actual transmitter units. And this is one of my favorite hawk owls down in the left-hand side of the pictures. Very feisty bird and caused lots of bleeding fingers. And then, we drove about 17,000 kilometers. It took about 1,800 hours and 13 different volunteers. So many different trips going out, trying to find these birds, and, scanning areas where we hadn't had any reports, but we thought would be good habitat. So it took a lot of time and effort to do this. So in terms of data analysis, I was able to kind of follow the same home range pattern of using minimum convex polygons. So it's just a way to map out the perimeter of kind of where these hawk owls are, but it doesn't take into account the density of points. So I also created kernel density estimates, and that accounts for how many points are in a certain area within that home range. So it's kind of looking at the density of where those birds are. And there's another thing that happens, especially with tracking data, called autocorrelation, where it's sort of unable to see, it's an individual bird that we're tracking, but it's kind of taking into account more points for that bird than it should be. So there's kind of a bunch of just different modeling ways to make sure you're getting sort of an accurate representation of the data you have. And then creating my species distribution model, I used maximum entropy modeling, which is really good for presence-only data. And since we were using eBird data, that's really all we had. We didn't have presence and absence. And it's really good for a small sample size. So that was sort of the reasoning behind choosing this. And then it's a machine learning method. So basically what that means is it learns from each model it creates. So it goes through several iterations. I did about 10,000 where it was learning each time from the previous iteration. So it's sort of learning along with me putting in the variables for the model. And this is, if you're a visual person like me, kind of how it works. So you have environmental data and then occurrence data that goes into this sort of modeling algorithm. Maxent is the one I chose, but there's other ones. And then it kind of goes through a calibration, setting up parameters, making sure it goes through those iterations and learning process. And then you get a predicted distribution and then a habitat suitability map. So it will kind of take those predicted distributions of the owls and then create a suitability map from that. So it's totally fine if you're confused at all, or maybe you're really good at modeling. But if you have questions about this, feel free to ask me after. So for question 1, though, do hawk owls establish a winter range or winter territory or home range? We really found from all of our 11 birds that the answer is yes, they do. Most birds stuck to a much smaller area than we previously had thought. So this figure is basically showing you the black line around each one is one bird's just perimeter, so that minimum convex polygon, all the points sort of as far out of their perimeter as they went. And then in the blue colors, you're looking at the 95% density estimate. So the light blue is the 95, the medium blue is 75, and then the dark blue is their core range. So where they spent most of their time at 50%. So you can kind of see what those numbers look like in terms of size. So for the minimum convex polygon, it was about 11.5 kilometers squared. And then going down further to the 50% of the range, it was on average only 2 kilometers squared. So to see that sort of as a maximum versus a minimum, the minimum size was 2.11 for the minimum convex polygon, and then the maximum was 34 kilometers squared. So there's a lot of individual variation. So if you just kind of look at this for a minute and sort of kind of look at these weird shapes, you can see that there's not necessarily a pattern jumping out at you, that each individual definitely had different movements, different densities. Some were, really long, some were really short. So kind of just thinking about the individual variation. And really what this makes me want to know is, are more hawk owls doing this to increase the sample size and seeing if we're seeing a similar pattern? But that did answer the first question of it. It seems like, yes, they are creating sort of this winter territory and sticking to an area, even if it's really small or really large, all winter long. And then just to show you sort of what these ranges look like with satellite imagery, I just wanted to kind of show you sort of the habitat piece. This was the female that had the largest home range. So it had that 34 kilometer squared range. And you can see that lots of different habitat types were found within her range. So a lot of dense kind of conifer forest mixed with a lot of agricultural land, especially up in here. There's lots of farms, and then some really boggy areas up on the right side of this home range. So really cool to just see this against satellite imagery. And here's a couple more. So these were two birds that we caught pretty close to each other, about a week apart. We didn't actually know there were two hawk owls in the area, but it was really cool to find another one. And they did happen to be male and female. We're not sure if, they were thinking about mating or anything like that, or if they were siblings. We're really not sure because we just took a blood sample and found out later on that they were male versus female. But just from this, you can see that the females' range is much smaller than the males. But in general, all of their sort of points were associated with tamarack and black spruce bog. And this is up in Roseau, Minnesota. And then these were two birds in Canada, just to again show you some variation. One was a female, one was male. I did do some statistical tests, and in terms of size, the size of the range wasn't significantly different between males and females, but again, we only had two males to look at, so it's sort of hard to make that comparison. But yeah, here, I think these birds, spent about half their time in, lots of forested areas, and then a lot of time in bogs. You might notice that there is some like agricultural kind of farmland around some of these. But in terms of the points, when the location was taken, most of them were not taken on farmland. So maybe they were flying in and catching something quickly and then going back to the forest, but it didn't seem like they were selecting for farmland. So just kind of a few visuals to show you what those ranges look like with actual habitat underneath them. All right, so that leads us to question 2. So looking at if we can build a species distribution model and see if it's accurately predicting places where hawk owls are found. So we used 616 unique eBird observations from 2000 to 2022. And there's sort of this extreme filtering process using the OCR package that basically, gets rid of hotspots, gets rid of, 40 people seeing one owl, that type of thing. So it took a while to get a good data set and good quality data for that. And then really looking for independent observations. So trying to find owls that are not the same bird, moving, half a mile down to another post. So there were 9 land cover variables and then 3 edge characteristics, because we know that hawk owls really like edges that were used in this model. So looking at land cover classes, we had forest, grassland, barren land, wetland, farmland, developed land, open water, and then distances to forest, open water, and open land. So again, just to kind of refresh your mind of how this works is we have this eBird occurrence data, and really this is just showing Minnesota, but we used all of Manitoba as well in the study area. And then using those environmental data layers, putting them into the modeling software, so using R and Java, and then getting a predictive map that later would show us a habitat suitability map. So through that whole process, which took quite a bit of time because I'm not a statistician or particularly apt at machine learning methods, but it gave us some really cool data. So to orient you to these maps, over here on the left side, we have northern Minnesota, where sort of all the eBird data, for the most part, of hawk owls was found, and then southern Manitoba. And what we found and why we separated this is we were getting really different results for northern Minnesota versus Manitoba, which at first we were really kind of scratching our heads and saying, okay, they're fairly close in terms of geographic range. Why are we seeing these differences? And before we got these maps, I should note that roads are very, they're great for seeing hawk owls, but if you're using the data, if you're kind of submitting something to eBird, it always kind of submits from your location, which is generally on a road, versus the actual owl's location. So we had to do some finagling of a lot of these variables, because when we first put the model in, it said that tons of hawk owls would be in Minneapolis or Winnipeg, because it was, denoting that the roads were really good habitat for hawk owls. So luckily, we figured that out and we're able to eliminate roads and replace it with the habitat that would have been there. So sorry for that little jaunt, but what you're seeing here is in sort of this blue color up to green. Blue is going to be where no hawk owls exist. So a lot of open water, sometimes really dense conifer forest. So we found that up in Manitoba, that hawk owls really were negatively selecting for the dense conifer forest that existed. And then green is, maybe it's okay, maybe it's not. It's sort of that half and half for hawk owl suitability. And then up into the red, or sort of the orange and red, are those hot spots of where you would really find hawk owls. So in terms of what was suitable, we found these pockets, especially in Minnesota, of really red areas. And looking at the satellite imagery, those are a lot of bogs. So this is Upper Red Lake and Lower Red Lake, if you're familiar with this area. And surrounding it, there's a lot of uninterrupted bogland. And there's a lot of sort of timber activity with black spruce forests in particular. So creating those open spaces that hawk owls like. So we found that there was more kind of concrete kind of habitat that was suitable for hawk owls in northern Minnesota, even though more are found in general in southern Manitoba. So switching gears to southern Manitoba, you can see, I've zoomed this in a little bit, but maybe I should a little more, that there's still a lot of red and orange that's being represented, but it's much more fragmented. And what we found looking sort of at the land cover is that there's a lot more flat agricultural activity interspersed with these, awesome bog areas in southern Manitoba. So it's just a lot more fragmented in terms of the habitat that is available to hawk owls, but that doesn't necessarily mean, there's not as much suitable hawk owl habitat. It's just that it's much more kind of piecemeal. So just to give you an idea of what that habitat suitability looks like in terms of the models, we did find that they were pretty decent at predicting the habitat. So this graph, which I don't need to get into the details about because it's kind of complicated, but basically shows you how accurate your model is. So if my model was really poor, it would just follow this black line. So it would be random if, hawk owls were choosing an area, next to an edge or forest or something like that, versus farmland or grassland. But what we found, and you can kind of follow this curve up, is that it was at about a 0.7 to 0.8 goodness of fit, which basically means that they did a pretty good job at predicting what was suitable for hawk owls. So that was encouraging to see, especially after 10,000 iterations of going through the modeling software. All right, so in terms of key takeaways, hawk owls do have winter home ranges, at least from the 11 birds that we were able to put transmitters on, and some were much smaller than we expected. So some were sticking to an area really closely for months at a time. And then we did find that hawk owls select habitat with edges. So they were really selecting for those forest edges or edges to open water, but they were avoiding farmland and grasslands in the winter. Which again was kind of interesting because a lot of the anecdotal data, like people, telling us sightings, or maybe there's a farmer that has a hawk owl that kind of follows its tractor searching for prey. We see a lot of hawk owls in farmland areas, but they're not necessarily using that habitat. They're probably just coming down to, pick off a mouse or a shrew or, a vole if it's their favorite type of food. So they're going back to the forest and spending a lot more time there, but very infrequently using that farmland, or at least that's what we are guessing. And then lastly, just thinking about types of birds to study and, what studies are out there. It's just important to collect information on understudied species and kind of add some information to their natural history, and especially as the climate is changing, trying to get a better idea of what these birds are doing. So in terms of future goals, if I'm able to, either pass this project on to another student or continue it myself, I'd love to expand the study to this full southern edge across the North American boreal forest to, one, increase the sample size, just because that's always better for statistical power and trying to really understand what the species is doing, not just the individual. So kind of getting that whole picture of what they're doing in the winter along that edge. And then also kind of pull in climate modeling, habitat suitability, and small mammal presence. So I think combining those and forming, kind of a bigger, more kind of inclusive of all these things that affect hawk owls models would be really beneficial to understanding why they are where they are, if they have, potentially different behaviors than we've previously thought, and being able to especially look at their food source. And then expanding to spring and summer movements and looking at dispersal rates. So we did get some summer data, which I'll show you in a second, not a ton, but it would be really interesting to see how these birds are moving, if they're kind of, showing some more migratory behavior than we previously thought, if they're going farther, if they're dispersing, earlier or later. It would just be great to understand that. And then potentially informing conservation and land management plans, especially for northern forests. So maybe, these small cuts, less than 100 hectares big, would be beneficial, but trying to stop bigger cuts from happening. So a little bit of bonus data that I was able to get from my birds that gave us some summer data was that we had 5 birds that kind of, I would say like the 3rd or 4th week in April started moving, and a lot of them moved farther north. So you can see, so winter represents blue, and that's really where that whole range in the winter was. And then the white squares are where they were in the spring and the summer. So this is the bird from Zach Zim. Made it up here, but we lost contact with it, unfortunately. And I was really hoping it would come back, but we haven't heard back from it yet. But some of these birds, especially the ones in Roseau, Minnesota, went really far north in about a week's time. So it was interesting to see that really kind of northern movement. They took their time in some places, but went pretty far. And so it's just interesting to think about how we categorize migratory birds versus birds that don't migrate, that are more residential or nomadic. So kind of questioning if there is some potential migratory behavior. And then this was just one kind of graphic showing you the range of the bird, the female from Roseau, Minnesota. So that's where she spent her whole winter, just in this sort of 2-kilometer area. Kind of cool to see all of those movements. And then I think it was April 23rd, I want to say, she started moving north and did this pretty insane movement over about a week's time. Crossing Lake Winnipeg. Spent a little bit of time, I think this was over 5 days, in this really cool boggy area. And then went up to an area really where there were no roads, and we lost contact with the bird in August of 2022. So just to kind of show you, one journey's path of a hawk owl. And she went over 1,000 kilometers. So kind of cool to see that. So that brings me to just acknowledgements. The Northern Hawk Owl Project team was pretty big, and it included a lot of people that I would not have, been able to do this without a lot of their support. So my advisor, Dr. Matthew Ederson, out of University of Minnesota in Duluth. He also works for the EPA. He's up here. My whole lab group, really supportive, both in the field and helping me with my analysis. Frank Nicoletti of Hawk Ridge was integral in designing this project and helping me get all of the supplies and permitting and things like that. So I can't thank him enough. Jim and Patsy Duncan were really huge in expanding my study. Otherwise I would only have a couple owls. So it was really helpful to have them on board and helping me with my project. Dr. Alexis Grindy gave me a lot of my summer funding, and then my friend Abby Valine, and really good researcher, came up to Canada with me on a 4-day trip, and we were able to catch some hawk owls. And then Daniel Erickson as well, helping with that. Long list of people on here that were really awesome and really helpful for getting this research off its feet and being able to be presented to you. And then in terms of funding, a lot of funding support. I was pretty blown away by some of the grants I was able to get, and then people who gave and got t-shirts from the fundraiser. Really, the crowdfunding fundraiser raised about half of the funds needed for this project, so that was huge. But Friends of Zaxton Bog, Cellular Tracking Technologies for really making this technology possible to get this data, which was pretty incredible. Raptor Research Conference and Foundation, Wilson Ornithological Society, Discover Owls, the Minnesota Ornithologists Union, Project Snowstorm for helping with ideas. And then one anecdote is I was able to catch an owl that was right in between the US and Canada border. So sort of in no man's land. And they were very supportive in helping me, be able to walk out there and then capture the owl, which sadly was too small for a transmitter, but they all got to see it. The most important thank you was obviously to the hawk owls. Wouldn't be possible to study them without their presence. So really an amazing species to study, and I really miss them this winter. And there's a few in Minnesota that are being spotted right now, which is cool to see. With that, I think we have like 15 minutes or something like that for questions. So thanks for your time, and I will take any questions you have.
Thanks, Hannah. That was really interesting and a super cool experience. So thank you for sharing. We have a couple questions in the chat that I can just read off. I'm not sure if you can see them great when you're sharing. So one of the questions was, what do hawk owls eat? And what's near the bogs that attracts them specifically?
Great question. Yeah, they really like red-backed voles and meadow voles. So really kind of, I don't know, small rodents. They'll eat other things, but voles are definitely their preferred food. But they've been seen catching an ermine in the bog a few years ago. So I was carrying this, big white ermine, which was cool to see. Red squirrels occasionally. There was a anecdote submitted from Canada that had a trail cam on a lynx carcass, and a hawk owl defended and ate from the carcass for like 25 days. So they are known to scavenge as well and potentially take small birds. So in general, they'll probably really try to eat anything, but voles are definitely their preferred food. And then in terms of kind of what attracts them to bogs, I think as a natural phenomenon, bogs have some open areas intermixed with some of their kind of bigger forests or dense forests. So they're able to find, a perch site, but still have an area to find small mammals to hunt. So I think that's kind of a big attraction for them. Good question.
Thanks. That is a great question. So second question that we have in the chat here, do hawk owl eruptive years correlate with other boreal owl eruptive years? Are hawk owls predated by larger owls, eagles, or others? So kind of a two-parted question there.
Yeah, so in terms of eruptions, they have been known to erupt with great grays in 2004 and 2005, which I wish I was alive during that time, or I was alive, but I wish I was doing this research during that time. There was a huge eruption of both hawk owls and great grays, where there were, hundreds, if not thousands, in northern Minnesota, probably northern Wisconsin, definitely a ton of great grays, and then quite a few hawk owls as well. That hasn't really happened again to the extent that we saw in 2004 and 2005. There have been some other small eruptions, 2011, 2012, 2018, 2019, but there hasn't been anything like that. Some people think that they potentially correlate with boreal owls, but it seems like more so with great grays. So not on the same cycle as saw-whet owls or long-eared owls, but potential with boreal owls, although there's quite a few conflicting feelings about that. And then will you read me the second part of the question?
Sure. So the second part was, are hawk owls predated by larger owls or eagles or other predatory birds?
Yeah, in general, no. Especially larger owls, it doesn't seem like there's, really a lot of predation that's happening. They are very bold. Hawk owls are very bold owls and will just sit at the very top of the canopy. And so they, definitely during nesting season, great horned owls, goshawks, things like that. I don't think eagles would be very common. Can go after, maybe the female or the chicks in the nest. But in general, not a lot of predation. And a big reason why I kind of went with this and chose the solar panel for the transmitters was because they're sitting at the top of the canopy most of the time. And so they're getting a lot of sunlight being up there. So very brave, brazen species of owl.
That might tie into our next question, which was what time of day do they hunt most? But I'm assuming if they're sitting at the top of the canopy, often they're mostly diurnal hunters.
Yeah, so they definitely are hunting during the day. Sometimes you'll see them, catch prey within half an hour of each other. So it's kind of cool to be able to actually see that, since a lot of owls are not diurnal. But I did see in some of my tracking data that there was some activity at night. I'm not able to say if, specifically it was hunting, but it's potential that they have hunt, or do hunt occasionally at night as well, but generally during the day.
All right, we're going to just canvass the room here to see if anybody's got a question, and Brad can translate.
The question is, do your studies show that the bird would return to the same home range during the winter year after year?
That's a great question. And unfortunately, I cannot answer it because none of my hawk owls have checked back in. So unfortunately, we did get some data from the summer, but for some reason, it could have been transmitter malfunction, because these transmitters were supposed to last about 2 years, but they're so new that it's hard to say. But we were really hoping to get at least one bird coming back in the winter and have not had that happen yet. There were 2 birds that sort of gave it's called like a mortality signal when the battery life goes way down and you're able to sort of pinpoint that spot. And I went and searched for them and was not able to find anything. No evidence of a dead hawk owl, no evidence of just a transmitter laying there. So my guess is the transmitter potentially just stopped working. But it's kind of an unknown and unfortunate. So fingers crossed, there's still 2 birds that I think we could hear from, and it'd be awesome if they came back, but no word on that yet.
And I noticed on your maps of the home ranges, there were 2 core areas, it seemed like, in every one of them. Was there any significance to that? Or?
Yeah, so that kind of brought up for me a question of, were they using sort of those 2 areas for roosting or something like that? Because it seemed like the densities were changing, and I can go back. Let's see. Can you go? Yeah, just to show that. Yeah, so in terms of their points, there was more points in those sort of core ranges, and pretty much all of them had that. It seemed likely because of the time signature that they were roosting locations. But what was really interesting is it didn't seem like they had just one particular roosting location. So you can kind of see in this bigger one that there's big clumps of sort of a lot of different points. And it seemed like what they were doing is always coming back to those core ranges and potentially roosting there. But it was in areas that weren't consistent. So they were roosting like next to maybe where they were hunting the previous day, but sort of always in that core range. So kind of cool to see that. But yeah, really those 2 blobs just represent those were the most dense areas. And so for like this one up here, there were quite a few of those dark circles, but most only had 2. Good question.
Any other questions here?
So I have a quick question.
Yeah.
You mentioned that these are potential species that are impacted by climate change. And you also it was kind of clear that they didn't love ag fields as far as, or even grasslands for suitable habitat. They might use it, but didn't love it. So if their range, even though they're gaining range by going further north, if it's more tundra-ish and less trees, do you think that might have an impact on them if they might be able to hunt, but then you had mentioned they kept going back to the forest really for that habitat? Is that of concern for the future?
Yeah, I think it is a big concern, and not just for hawk owls, but for a lot of these boreal forest species, where the big problem is especially the trees. So a lot of trees, if temperatures increasing in the boreal forest, are dying out. And so I think what a lot of these birds, especially, nest in big trees. So hawk owls need sort of a large snag to nest in, or at least a large tree with the top off. And as you go further and further north, you're not going to find those. So that can affect things like boreal owls, could affect, saw-whet owls to some extent if they're going further north, woodpeckers, blackbacks, three-toads, things like that, where if you're, losing a lot of this critical habitat, then you're gaining some, but you don't know what the quality of that habitat is. And like you said, there's more tundra, there's more just open spaces without those big forests. So I think that could have a really big, negative impact on hawk owls, unfortunately. And there are people that are looking at, trying to use assisted migration of trees and trying to plant more and more trees as we know that these forests are starting to recede. But it's hard to, know if these owls respond to those tree species they're trying to use. So it's a kind of tumultuous period, but I do think hawk owls are going to be threatened by it. Yeah.
Okay. I don't see any more questions in the chat, and I think you answered all the questions we have here in the room. And there's one more. Do the Canadian forest fires impact the owl's success?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, there's some researchers in Canada actually that have looked at a lot of fire presence in hawk owls, mainly in the breeding season. And what they found is between like the 3 and 7 year range of a fire, there's more hawk owl detection. So hawk owls, kind of thinking about those open spaces, really like fires. Now, thinking of the last Canadian fires that were huge, right, that were, burning whole forests, definitely not beneficial because hawk owls still need, perch sites, nest sites, things like that. But fires that are, I don't know what size exactly, but smaller, can be really beneficial for a lot of bird species, and hawk owls are one of them. So fires that are extreme, not so good, but fires that sort of normally happen and are not so severe are actually really beneficial for hawk owls. And that leads to a lot of small mammal disturbance, but maintaining some of the forest within those burns. So yeah, Hannah and Hoyt are the researchers, and they've done some really cool work looking at fire presence with hawk owls. Good question.
Awesome.
Well, thank you very much. Excellent program.
Well, thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate it. And any chance that I can talk about hawk owls, there's not a lot of research. I just presented at the World Owl Conference in Wisconsin, actually, in October, in La Crosse. And I was the only one studying hawk owls at that place. And there was over 100 researchers. So thank you for giving me the time and your attention.
Maybe it's the negative 42-degree temperatures.
I might Thanks again.
Thank you.
And, thank you guys.
Just to make people think a little bit warmer, for our January program, which is January 18th, we're going to be talking about, I think it was Hawaiian honey creepers. And that will be a Zoom program, but I believe we will be showing it here at the Education Center as well. So join us for that one. But otherwise, have a happy holiday season, and thanks everyone for coming. And Hannah, especially, thanks. We appreciate you being here.
Yeah, of course. Bye. Happy holidays, everybody.
All right. Have a great night, everyone.
Good night. How many did we have total on Zoom at the end?